English translation 920th Contact Sunday, the 26th of October 2025, 11:46 hours.
Here I am, happy to be filling in for Quetzal for the next 5 weeks while he is away. But greetings, dear friend Edward. As usual, it is a great honor for me to be able to converse with you in conversations that I can record with my device and dictate to you later, as Quetzal also handles it, because retrieving the conversations is no longer possible due to the disruptive religious energies.
Salami Bermunda, greetings to you also. I am also pleased that you are the representative. You and Jana and Fluina can still do what you have done so far. That you come here together and the four of us can chat. You always have so many interesting things to report. As far as the disturbing energies are concerned, this is really bad. But neither Bernadette, who corrects all the contact reports, nor Christian, Daniela, and more recently, Andreas H. and I, are letting it get to us. It is just that it is sometimes difficult for me to get my bearings again in the present time, because unfortunately my stroke means that I am also no longer able to fully switch on the controls against this darned energy that is affecting my work, which means that it takes much longer to get everything corrected, etc. ready. As a result, the fact that everything is dictated after the conversations means that it takes longer to get everything out. The whole thing might also be a bit more difficult due to the time difference.
Yes, I understand that, but we have to stick to the fact that we move back from the present time by days or weeks at a time. Consequently, we cannot be present in your workspace at the time because we are.
Of course not. There just has to be a connection here because of the phone, and if I am wanted, then I have to be here quickly, which has always worked so far.
Which will also stay that way, which will not get you into trouble.
You know, I still worry about it sometimes though. Because the radar over on the mountain, you know, the surveillance?
You can really not worry about that, because we never invade the space that is being monitored by the radar, because we stay away from it with the flying apparatus. That is why coming to you is designed to radiate, in the same way as when we come for you. This means that nothing can be registered despite constant surveillance. It would be really fatal for you and also for us if we could be tracked, because then
all hell would break loose, as we say, if something unpleasant were to happen. I already know what you are saying, but sometimes thoughts come up that are prone to worry. But look here, there is talk of Greta Thunberg, which I think is not really about really seeking or wanting to spread peace, but rather just about being in the public eye and making herself big and world famous. This can also earn money, which does not have to be worked for, because stupid people from the population donate a lot of money as her followers, and she does not have to work for it, but can indulge in her hobby. What do you mean?
the way I look at it, you may be correct in your view. But that is not so important, because what I found in the annals of SFOF, and what you wrote at the age of 8, I find it all the more remarkable that you were already so knowledgeable about writing back then, and
That was not my merit, but Saaf's, because he was the one who taught me to read and write. But what have you read and found in his annals that you find remarkable? I am curious to know what that might be, and what he found it necessary to note in his annals.
there are various very remarkable things about you that SFOF recorded and wrote down. The one I want to read to you, which I consider very remarkable, is one of them.
The connection of the humans. The human being is one with himself, fellow human beings, with nature and with life, then they live in love and peace carries this out into the world positive waves, which also bring very valuable changes, that which begin with oneself, and all of which righteous among fellow human beings, and make them think the same way, feel, and also sense how they can also live honestly in this sense from now on. February 3rd, 1944, Eddie, Meterflex 1253, Bulock.
It is a long time since I wrote that. But something else. The so-called International Climate Conference is coming up again, where, as usual, half-baked and idiotic solutions are being sought that will do nothing to protect the climate. All of the crackpots who are consulting have still not realized that all of their lowly intelligent and idiotic proposals and resolutions are useless. The only solution that would be correct is one that the great powers and wannabes do not realize, namely that only the rapid and radical reduction of overpopulation can be beneficial in order to protect the climate and restore it to health. This is because the entire destruction of the climate is caused solely by the machinations of overpopulation. This also includes wars, which also destroy nature and impregnate the atmosphere with toxic gases. Askett and I talked about this back in 1962 when I told her my view on overpopulation, because it had increased by about 1 billion in only about 10 years. And, as Asfay Ath and I saw, after the first quarter of the new century of the new millennium, merely 10 billion human beings were overpopulating the Earth. And we also saw, as a result of our time jumps, what will happen in the future as a result of the completely irresponsible machinations of overpopulation with regard to the destruction of the climate, to which Asfay Ath and I came to the joint conclusion that the only way to avoid all climate destruction was to prevent the further increase in overpopulation, which could only be achieved by a controlled global birth rate freeze. However, this did not happen, so now only about 300 million human beings are missing to fill the 10 billion. Now the 10 times clever, idiotic and loudmouth rulers want to start another climate conference and present their loudmouthness again. But in their low intelligence, they are again unable to recognize the correct thing to be done to protect the climate, and slowly let it return to normal, namely through a worldwide controlled birth stop and corresponding educational cooperation with the peoples.
That would indeed be the only real solution, but as you say, the low intelligence of those in charge will neither recognize nor decide this. But what you wrote is amazing for your age. Swath also wrote that he told you that you will age, but will always remain active and young. But what you say about the climate conference is actually the only effective way to save the climate, which we have also recognized. But this realization requires insight, and is being blocked by the narrow-mindedness and self-importance of those in charge of all state.
Yes, that is probably just not something that can be changed. But with regard to the other thing you say about what Esfa Oth told me, I am grateful that I can still walk upright and do my work. I was always on the move during my lifetime, and I say that was the reason I did not get rusty. Although I lost my left arm in the bus accident in Iskenderun, I have endeavored to disregard this and still do my work.
This is well worthy of your own thanks, for you yourself have kept yourself in constant motion, treading many millions of kilometers in many parts of Earth, and also with Swath elsewhere far from it. You also traveled a lot on foot with Ascot, as she recorded in her notes. You also traveled on foot with Simyase on various occasions, as can be seen from her descriptions, although she also noted that initially, when you started your work at the center, you also showed off your various skills, so to speak, and...
Yeah, that was idiotic of me, and I should not have done that, and there is no excuse me for it. Somehow, unfortunately, I was observed doing something that I was not only using my physical strength to do, but just, well, you know. Unfortunately, it was unavoidable that everything was spread around and I was softened up, and I then idiotically, well, it was like that, unfortunately, and I could still tear my hair out for it today. It was really stupid and faultless of me, and this low intelligence was effectively not something I could call good.
What was done in the early days you could not have changed afterwards, and you also cannot undo it now.
Tell me about it. I know that myself. But all the events of that time were recorded in writing in a book that Bernadette made called A Life, and when I look up in it what happened in the early days in terms of what I should not have done, then I feel ashamed, and I do not know, even though I often think about why I acted that way. The Bernadette's note. A Life will consist of several volumes, and the volume published so far is only about events from Billy's childhood, up to his departure from SFAF. The events mentioned by Billy will be included in the third volume at the earliest. It was really idiotic, at least I realized that, and stopped doing it, so I only acted that way in secret sometimes. But unfortunately I was careless once because I was not attentive enough. So I did not see that Michael was watching me. But that taught me why, since then, well, that was it. But what I also want to say is that Bernadette is also the person who has to be annoyed with me, so to speak, because these damned religious energies are constantly messing with our work, because sentences and words are constantly being moved around, torn apart, letters and numbers inserted into the words or whole paragraphs simply removed, when I save the whole thing to the stick, so that I then have to insert what is missing again, or have you dictate it again.
I am aware of that, and it is very annoying for you, I know. Unfortunately, Alien and its many employees have not yet been able to find and apply anything effective against it. But what you say about the book, it is very good, because it provides proof that you really are the human being you are supposed to be in every respect. What I want to say now, however, is that it is demonstrated again and again by many human beings who, however.
Yes, I know what you want to say, and in my view, any demonstration for peace is of no use, unless fundamentally all those human beings have in themselves a firmness of character for peace, who demonstrate for this, and that, because everything peaceful does not allow for violence of any wise. Consequently, a demonstration for peace has to be absolutely non-violent, and does not allow for riots, hatred, and also revenge and destruction. The human being who takes part in a demonstration for peace, and also carries it out in this way, or simply takes part in a so-called peace demonstration, should be honestly orientated in his or her personality towards effective peace, because only in this way can real peace be represented, advocated, and demonstratively requested in true peacefulness. But unfortunately, the majority of human beings are becoming more and more primitive and depraved in their attitudes, more and more hateful and abusive, just as racial hatred and primitive religious hatred are becoming more and more prevalent, and the propensity for violence has also been breaking through among adolescents for 7 years now. At the beginning of this year, a 4-year-old strangled his 2-year-old sister because he was angry, while now a 13-year-old boy has become a murderer. And adolescent girls and boys in general are committing violence and vile offenses that only adults used to commit. Truly, only human beings can educate themselves through their self-education from childhood onwards, and can therefore never be educated by parents, etc., whereby the sheer lie of educating and being educated falsifies and denies everything that human beings educate themselves, according to what they absorb and memorize for themselves, what they see, hear, feel, experience, and assimilate, and accordingly shapes their behavior and conduct, etc. In this way, they also form their character and behavior. In this way he also forms his character and his attitude towards true and complete peace, and in every respect towards absolute peacefulness, if he strives for it. Around, the human being forms and molds himself in his life, and makes himself capable of keeping, representing and practicing peace, with full awareness always, and without exception in every situation, in a truly peaceful manner. Only in this wise is the human being effectively completely free, and always turned towards true peace without violence, dedicating himself to it, and also living in accordance with it. For an earthly state, however, peace means only pseudo-peace, similar to a peace of victory in war, whereby only the absence or lack of war and all violence, and thus an enforced state of calm is given. This pseudo-peace, and the pseudo-peace associated with it, is unfortunately also evident in parts, that is to say not all, of the Antifa movement, which should actually only stand for anti-fascism and would be correct in this respect, but in some cases has the exact opposite, very unpleasant effect. As I said some time ago, this would be the case if everything was handled in accordance with freedom and righteousness, and effectively and genuinely campaigned against right-wing extremism, nationalism, that is to say, Nazism, as well as racism and fascism, and etc. However, many members of the relevant Antifa groups and individuals act, see and understand everything wrongly, and do exactly the opposite of what would be correct. The term is unfortunately multi-layered, and comprehensively permeated by various forms of action, and thus also by a roaring misunderstanding of what is right and what is wrong, thus revealing a broad misunderstanding of what anti-fascism actually is and what it is against everything, and every political injustice, violence, injustice, and in general against everything that is political pressure and tyranny. This misunderstanding leads to false teachings, false educational information, incitement and protest behavior by Antifa supporters of both sexes as a result of misunderstanding or for personality reasons, false accusations, violence, evil assassinations, blackmail, destruction, and even murder and manslaughter, as well as all kinds of malicious fripperies directed against the democracy of a constitutional state. Basically, the actual value of Antifa groups or Antifa individuals is thus abused, whereby the ideology of peace is trampled underfoot and ultimately becomes a deviant, anti-state and evil work of the devil. But this is exactly what we at the FIGU want nothing to do with, because our endeavor is geared towards enlightenment and the pursuit of our own clear thinking, contrary to all religious and secular beliefs, and also the development of righteousness as true human beings. From a political point of view, we consistently represent our own self-image against any form of nationalism and neo-Nazism, and thus against all Nazi thinking and Nazi behavior. We are also strictly opposed to all forms of anti-Semitism and extreme right-wing ideologies, xenophobia, racism, nationalism, fascism, and political authoritarianism, which are all abominations to us. And in this regard, I said that as FIGUans, we are not concerned with beliefs of any kind, but that we FIGU members are only concerned with self-thinking and correct behavior. With regard to the rejection of wrong forms of government, we allow ourselves to express our opinion in this regard, but to remain inactive with regard to interference of any wise, in the form of demonstrations or activities. We only take the liberty of pointing out discrepancies in order to educate, but we never interfere in politics, because we all respect federalism, direct democracy, and the neutrality of our country, as befits the Swiss. Our FIGU thinking, therefore, does not include the repertoire of the use of violence, and thus the false sentiments of Antifa, but is comprehensive and largely orientated towards real peace, without ifs and buts. What is opposed to what is right and correct among the organized actual Antifa supporters does not correspond to what we FIGUans represent in the sense of true peace and true freedom. Namely, that these can never and never be achieved through critarchy, patriarchy, slavery, oligarchy, sadism, autocracy, violence, despotism, dictatorship, domination, ochlocracy, tyranny, monocracy, and also not through lobbyocracy, hierocracy, globocracy, exarchy, epistocracy, ecclesiarchy, oppression, our politics, domestic violence, and also not through genital mutilation or cyber violence, extremism politics, bureaucracy, psychological terror, kyriarchy, coercion and war, stifling of freedom, minarchy, androcracy, anarchy, kleptocracy, kakistocracy, etc. No security can also be achieved in this wise, for by the opposite of what I have mentioned, only an illusory security, or an unworthy illusory peace, and thus an illusory harmony can exist. It is therefore impossible for true peace to gain lasting validity in this wise, because order and peace can only be maintained to a certain degree, for a longer or shorter period of time, through a variety of laws, prohibitions, regulations, recommendations, ordinances, and so on. In a peace that comes about through the victorious end, the winning party usually determines its laws, recommendations, rules, prohibitions, ordinances and regulations, etc., in accordance with its strict victorious manner. This means that the entire population defeated in the war then lives in a state of character, mental and personality peacekeeping, and is anchored in it. Actually, the truth is that human beings on Earth do not know a broad definition of peace. Consequently, they absolutely only see political, psychological, and so-called positive peace on a large scale, but this only exists to some extent as a result of the mere absence of war, terror, dictatorship, and coercion, and goes beyond this in such a way that the absence of structural violence and dictatorship includes enforced social justice and a certain degree of prosperity. However, true and effective peace is not this, but effectively only a state of faith, such as between states, among groups, religions, and organizations, or also, on a small scale, such as in friendships, schools of all kinds, families, or working communities, etc., which can adopt a mendacious attitude of peace in silent violence or in irritating faith. So this is nakedly only a so-called and sick illusory peace, which corresponds, so to speak, only to a state peace, and immediately turns into hatred, violence and enmity, etc., as soon as something goes out of line or otherwise crooked, because then the well-known principle immediately applies: if you do not want to be my brother, then I will smash your head in. So this form of peace corresponds to a blatant and big lie, which is presented to the outside world with theatrical credulity, but which harbors suppressed and repressed fear, which they try to cover up with grand and mendacious speechifying. However, if the people smell a rat and resist, then state orders from the majority of the powerful rulers result in terror being exercised by the security forces under their command, or, if necessary, by murder military organizations that monitor everything. This is also the case when large-scale demonstrations are organized by the people, which are completely unwanted, and demonstrators are arrested, beaten up, or shot without further ado. This depends on the state in which the whole thing takes place, and whether injustice is done before justice. But in any case, demonstrations always take place under circumstances in which the demonstrators do not correspond in their character to the being that should absolutely only be orientated towards effective peace, because always and practically without exception, the character of the demonstrators is generally formed in such a way that hidden, and thus in one way or another violence is lurking, and then erupts, when control over it is lost. If the character and attitude of the demonstrators is not completely resolved and elevated above the strife, hatred, anger, and rage, then the whole demonstration will not lead to peace, but will become unreal and farcical, because violence, incitement, and hatred become abusive and trigger revenge. Religions, and especially their insane beliefs and racial hatred, give rise to murderous wars and terror, which claim countless human lives. But all this would effectively not have to be, because if the rulers, the leaders, as you call them, did not indulge in their greed for power and irrationality, but also had just a little bit of sense and reason, as well as really good, positive, and balanced intrinsic or altruistic behavior, then there would be no more need for this. Altruistic behavior, then everything would work well and also correctly, so that there would be true peace and never war and terror, and all human beings would be taught righteousness by these rulers, instead of being made to believe something that only brings disaster and negativity. That would prevent a lot of evil, but the power-hungry, insipid sausages, who call themselves rulers, are obviously absolutely incapable of high values. On the contrary, they're only obsessed with their lust for power and their self-importance, which is the case in all countries on Earth, unfortunately also in Switzerland. Only very few righteous people, who can generally be counted on one hand, can be described as decent, honest and upright, honorable, honest and fair rulers, and they have a very difficult time against the unrighteous rulers. As a rule, therefore, it is unfortunately also almost inevitable that all the evil, power-hungry and self-serving rulers will stand together and interact so vehemently, maliciously and meanly against the few righteous ones, until they are ultimately removed from office as a result of the lies directed against them. Unfortunately, in addition to the righteous, there are also irresponsible, worm-like elements in the government who are destroying our Swiss neutrality, against which unfortunately nothing is done by the co-governors, and everything is tolerated by the unrighteous. And since populist policies are being pursued, these fallible, evil, power-hungry and self-serving elements in government are not able to bring about any real and true peace, because they do not even have a thought of really and genuinely working towards it. On the contrary, they are only focused on indulging their greed for power and their evil self-importance. These populist power-hungry people work against the people and against the respective national constitution and will not be held accountable for this, which Switzerland, for example, can sing a lousy song about, as neutrality was turned into a pig when sanctions were applied against Russia, that were copied from the EU dictatorship, and Switzerland's friendship with Russia went to hell as a result. The consequences for the federal councillor who had brought this about were nil, because instead of the obviously also power-hungry, self-important, cross-dumb rulers endeavoring to achieve one and true peace, and justly holding the guilty person to account, the rotten person responsible for treason was not removed from office and spiked away, and therefore not called to account, but on the contrary, was left scot-free in his office, where he can still remain and possibly continue to commit treason with impunity. This means that in Switzerland, as in the whole world, populism is on the rise again, claiming as political logic that only the person practicing populism, such as dictator Trump in the USA, in his very own personality, or even a government, is doing the right thing with regard to the true correct leadership of the people, or the implementation of the true will of the people. Populist, however, is a policy that falsely presents itself as close to the people, in order to endear itself to them and win them over, while mendaciously claiming to represent the sole will of the people. In this wise, populists also present mendacious solutions to existing problems that stir up people's fears, emotions, and prejudices. In this form, nasty populism is supposedly intended to stand up to corruption, or even a negative, elitist form of government that is opposed to it and to defend against it. Allegedly, because the populists simply simplify various complex problems with very simple slogans that deceive the people, create prejudices, and stir up fears among the people and mendaciously and deceitfully portray the populists as good and righteous politicians, and present them, so to speak, as the advocates of the common people against the power-hungry, who they themselves truly are, but who present themselves as innocent lambs, but in reality create strife, mandatory laws, regulations, rules, lack of freedom and bailiwicks, etc., thus making the people immature, which make the peoples immature. This does not create true peace, neither among the population of one's own country, nor among the populations of all countries, so that only discord, strife, hatred, revenge, and retaliation are ever produced, but never honest peace, let alone true peace. As a rule, populism is effectively only about asserting one-sided personal views and enforcing them. The fact that the true law and the will of the people are disregarded in the process is of no concern to the populists, so they also do not register this. Although Switzerland is constitutionally supposed to be a democracy in which the will of the people should be decisive in all circumstances and determined by a referendum, this has often been shamefully and unconstitutionally broken in recent years, with populists simply disregarding all votes and acting against the will of the people and the results of the referendum. For example, with regard to the vital biodiversity initiative, It was promised that the federal government would continue to spend CHF 600 million on biodiversity, and thus also on nature and environmental protection. 5 months later, however, the Federal Council reneged on this by breaking its word and simply cutting the budget, even though all voters had relied on the promise being kept and fulfilled. However, this did not happen at all. Instead, the result was that populist and autocratic actions were taken to the contrary, and the promise was broken in a degrading manner. However, this is not the only nasty and populist thing the Federal Council has done, as it has also repeatedly acted in a populist and absolutely high-handed manner with regard to both pesticide initiatives. However, there is really no excuse me for this, and also not when there are financial deficits, which, as far as I am concerned, indicate that simply financially, that the financial management was simply very poor and inappropriate, which clearly indicates that incompetent persons are at work with regard to the allocation of funds for this and that, who, as rivets in this respect, do not belong in the office assigned to them. This is especially true in this case, because these unjust, misguided, populist and self-aggrandizing financial cuts relate precisely to nature conservation and climate protection issues that are vital, not just for nature, its biodiversity and wildlife, but especially for human beings. But this apparently does not concern the federal counselor, who is obviously not fit for his office, and is therefore to be considered an incompetent personality, because, as he says, shooting wolves and beavers is more necessary than building motorways, etc., and than the important protection of the climate, nature, and the vital biodiversity of fauna and flora. This guy obviously has no idea of the vital importance and vital necessity of nature and its fauna and flora, and thus for all life, and thus for biodiversity. He also clearly has no idea that it is already well advanced in terms of dying and being destroyed. He is also apparently completely indifferent to the fact that this and that fauna and flora has already been wiped out, such as bird species, two of which are currently on the way to extinction. And there are also the wolves and beavers, which he simply wants to have shot, and enforce this in his low intelligence and irresponsibility, without being able to think and consider what evil and harm this would cause, that wolves are indeed predators, whose pups and young are preyed upon by eagles, large owls and bears. But attacks by wolves on human beings are extremely rare, one reason being rabies, while the other is provocation by human beings themselves. The third reason is, of course, food conditioning, whereby, on the one hand, this is mainly due to the fact that through the fault of human beings, the wild animal population is reduced, which is torn by the wolves as food, namely through the machinations of human beings, by building up etc. nature and most of the habitat of wild animals, while, however, sheep breeding and goat breeding is immensely increased by human beings, and huge herds enliven the pasture areas. This makes it clear that wolves, deprived of their roaming space and their food in the form of wild food animals, due to the irrationality of human beings, are feasting on sheep and goats kept on the pastures by their owners and breeders. On the other hand, the rodent beaver, popularly known as Master Bockert, builds dams in watercourses, streams and dams them up by cutting down trees and building dams. The beaver is a rodent with brownish fur, a flat scaly tail and webbed feet that lives in watercourses, swims well and builds structures and dams from tree trunks. The beaver is a harmless power animal for human beings, always industrious, creative, and full of energy. It is the second largest rodent on Earth, and completely harmless to human beings, but is unpopular with forest owners because it occasionally cuts down a tree to pursue its trade. The beaver does not hibernate, and through its way of life, it fulfills an important role in ecosystems, as its dams dam up the water, and thus create new habitats for amphibians and insects, thereby promoting biodiversity. Populism has apparently already become a habit in the Federal Council, also with regard to negotiating with the EU dictatorship, as well as persuading the people in the cantonal governments, etc., whereby they are beginning to follow suit, and the will of the people is being manipulated, turning more and more towards the bland, and becoming increasingly indifferent and irresponsible towards democracy and neutrality. Ultimately, and it is foreseeable that if the people do not wake up and do not defend themselves against the populism emanating from Bern and also from various other governments in general, this will lead more quickly to what is secretly being sought, namely, to bring the people or the peoples of the world under the hammer and to completely dismantle freedom, which is already far more advanced in this respect through laws, rules, ordinances, and regulations than it was in the times of the bailiffs. And AI will make things even worse, instead of better, because it is already intervening in people's lives to such an extent that individual persons will soon be controlled and monitored step by step to such an extent that even the smallest freedom is null and void. It is already being determined from above by the powerful to what extent freedom may still be severely restricted and controlled. But the indifferent and irresponsible peoples do not see or realize this. And those few who have their eyes, ears, and senses open and recognize and realize this, are stupidly ridiculed, or harshly and viciously attacked, taken out of circulation and locked up, or otherwise rendered harmless. To the point that the final step is taken, such as in America when the FBI was sent after Martin Luther King, and he was ultimately murdered. In the fact that rulers all over the world can practice their malicious populism with impunity, and are becoming ever more blatant in doing so, is amply demonstrated by the American dictator Trump, whose behavior is already rubbing off and spreading to various European countries, where lowly intelligent, hypocritical and domineering rulers are emulating him, although the stupid citizens are apparently completely unaware of this. Dictator Trump is the great domineering and delusional one, who wants to bring the entire earth under his hammer, which other so-called leaders around the world are about to imitate for their peoples, and curb the still small freedom of the individual peoples to such an extent that it is completely extinguished. The rulers do not know real freedom for the individual citizens of their people, for their whole character is not centered on this, but only on unlimited might. In contrast, children are still innocent, untainted by megalomania, lust for power, racial hatred, and religious mania, as this picture here, which I received from Michael, proves.
For peace in the world, let this photo go round the world.
All that you have said, I do not think it will be gleefully received by certain personalities.
I am fully aware of that, because certain people, especially those in government, cannot stand the truth, especially those who are sitting in might and just, as I said earlier, in their wise attitude and their whole behavior of populism, and indulge in it because they are addicted to it, by the skin of their teeth. In this respect, however, they are the opposite of human beings, who, far removed from such vile attitudes and behavior, are concerned about the existence of life and its laws.
That is unfortunately the case and cannot be changed so quickly. But earlier I wanted to ask you something here. This photograph I was able to make some time ago. Perhaps you can explain to me what these beings are all about.
Well, I am familiar with them. They are marine creatures that live in large groups. They existed about 40 million years ago, because I saw them at the time when we were together on one of the time jumps back in time. But in short, what you have photographed here are marine creatures called horseshoe crabs. These time jumps that I was able to make with SFAth were very instructive, and also interesting for me, because that is how I know that many claims made by archaeologists and paleontologists, etc., do not correspond to the truth when they make up their assumptions. Many things were completely different from what they claim. Animals, creatures, and other life forms of fauna and flora were very different from today, and various life forms have survived from then until today, except that they have changed and transformed over the past millions of years, and have changed their habitat. For example, creatures that live in deserts today, such as dromedaries and camels, etc., were forest dwellers in early times, while others are aquatic creatures that are land creatures today, but this is also the case the other way round. The stupid myth that dinosaurs were among the first land creatures also corresponds to unparalleled imbecility, because hundreds of millions of years before them, fur-covered and other large and small life forms inhabited the planet, also in huge forests. I remember land creatures that lived about 200 million years before the dinosaurs, and were about 3.5 meters long, and about 2 meters tall, and fur-covered.
Such records can also be found in the SWAF annals. He also wrote a lot about the fact that you are extremely reality-orientated and intensely truth-orientated, and therefore not a believer, but very thorough and concentrated, so that you perceive sensory impressions both physically and, as you say, mentally very penetratingly, sensitively, fiercely, powerfully, and very strongly. He also wrote that you react violently accordingly, in such a way that you bury yourself in yourself from one second to the next, only to need to be alone for a certain amount of time in order to be fully there again.
If he's already recorded that he's jumped through time with me, then that is probably a belief is idiotic and sick to me. But anyone who wants to believe and be lowly intelligent as a result is their own business, not to be meddled with. The human being is the smith of his own destiny, and therefore I would never insult, speak to, or even try to dissuade a human being about his faith. In any case, his faith is always his property, one way or another, whereby I am of course talking about his religious faith, because with regard to every worldly faith, it is a human duty to put something wrong right. Like those who believe that there is a cream or medication that would work against aging, or that something else could be done to stop aging. There are always adverts on TV saying that this and that would help, along the lines of lubrication and ointments help everywhere. Eva always says, if you do not want to grow old, you have to die young. She's right about that. But now listen to what emerges from this letter that I received yesterday, and that I am reading to you.
Dear Billy, 21 Po in T10. 2025 I have been thinking about your book Origin of All Existence. I have come to the conclusion that this book is a very important book that forms part of the foundation for our evolution to understand reality as a real absolutum. In my opinion, this information that you have written down is originally from the being absolute itself, and has been transmitted down through all lower absolutum forms down to creation, the pure creation energy levels, Pata-li and down to Arahat Atha-Sota. This book, in my opinion, is the foundation and thus the cornerstone for the basic knowledge of reality as real absolutum. The knowledge in this book is very important because human beings need to know that all life is one, that everything they think, do or do not do has an impact on reality because of cause and effect. The human being is an inseparable part of creation and thus of the sign absolutum, and this also says that the human being should be aware every second of his existence, that his thoughts and feelings, his evolution, and thus also the evolution of creation should serve all life. The extremes always touch each other. OM and Kybalion. The human being should live in the awareness that each life knows about the next, and that all life knows about ALL life. Without knowledge there is no existence. Therefore belief can never be real, as it is not knowledge. The sign absolutum knows relatively absolutely everything about life in its existence in sign, in highest relative absolute perfection. The one extreme. If the human being knows the being absolute, and only that, then he or she knows about the existence of ALL life, in the most rudimentary, basic form. The other extreme. This, in my opinion, is primary recognition of reality as a real absolutum. What do you think? Am I on the correct path? Kind regards and Salome, J.
Interesting. According to these lines, there is obviously real interest in learning the teaching. And what has been written speaks for itself and probably needs no answer on your part, because the writer has given it to himself.
You cannot say it seems that way, because it actually is, and that is very gratifying. But what do you say to the fact that Earthling scientists claim that uranium is the strongest force there is? I have already learned from SFAF that this does not correspond to the truth, because
But you know that which Sfaf explicitly explained to you, which he also listed in his annals, as I know, should not speak about it, because this knowledge would certainly lead to the fact, as a result of the unreasonableness and selfishness of Earth humans.
I realize that, although I also thought when I said it, that I would just talk to you about it, and then put my dots when you dictate everything to me later. SF also said, I still remember that it would be dangerous if certain travelers from afar also came to this knowledge.
The fact that he warned you about this is also contained in his annals, which means that you should keep quiet about it, because the dialogue reports that we dictate to you later could also, and it could be that. So there is no question that responsibility must be upheld. He also named in his annals that which is presently and in time to come in Otto.
Stop there. I think I know what you are going to say, to which I think, however, that we should not talk about it openly and consequently we keep quiet about it, because that is something that we have to be well aware of, and we do not go on talking about it as a result of the responsibility involved, because the danger. But while we are at it, there is elsewhere, namely to recognize that with regard to nature and its fauna and flora, there is no responsibility whatsoever on the part of the Federal Council and the entire Parliament of Switzerland. This raises the question of why the majority of power-obsessed rulers in Bern, as well as the rulers of all countries worldwide, do not realize how important and even vital nature and its flora and fauna are for human beings. Unfortunately, it is quite obvious that the majority of those in office are just complete rivets at work, who, and this is important to say repeatedly, have no idea whatsoever about nature, fauna and flora, meaning that they are completely ignorant of the fact that these are the very first vital necessity for human beings to exist at all. If nature and flora and fauna did not exist, there would also be no human beings, as they are completely dependent on them. However, those in power, their contributors and representatives in all offices, municipalities, etc., are so uneducated about nature, fauna, and flora that they pass mindless laws, rules, and regulations, etc., that do more harm than good. And when citizens do something correct and important for nature and its flora and fauna, they are penalized with fines and fining orders, etc., in accordance with the law. This is because they are accused of doing the correct thing as a result of the wrong laws, rules and regulations, etc., as is the case with me, and I have been fined for 4,000, a fine of FR 500 plus costs of FR 800, etc. This is more than idiotic. This is more than just idiotic, especially because the authorities have drawn up paragraphs that are truly against the protection of nature and its fauna and flora by experts who really do not understand anything about nature and its fauna and flora. Everything is being done to ensure that nature, fauna and flora are destroyed and exterminated, and that, in Zurich, German, humanity on Earth is slowly but surely dying a miserable death, as a result of the horrendous 20-fold overpopulation, against which the governments and authorities are also doing nothing, nor against religious hatred, ethnic hatred, racial hatred, and all military armament for murderous and destructive wars and terror of all kinds. All this while idiotically promoting motorways, factories, apartment blocks, sports grounds and other idiotic things in order to drive Earth humans to even greater heights, because obviously the 10 billion or so we already have are not enough to finally destroy the planet, all of nature and its fauna and flora. It is completely wrong to think and speculate that the more genera and species of the entire fauna and flora remain undiscovered and unexplored, or become extinct, the more highly potent chemical compounds might disappear. This is completely illogical thinking, because what does extinction have to do with undiscovered and unexplored genera and species of fauna and flora? Namely, nothing at all. Nevertheless, experts who deal with the biodiversity of fauna and flora claim that there is a connection, and that the extinction of undiscovered and unexplored genera and species of fauna and flora would lead to the disappearance of highly valuable chemical poisons. But this is nothing more than an inane assertion that is plausibly idiotic to even the lowestly intelligent earthly, and in no way corresponds to any valuable background knowledge. It is undeniable that the protection of the diversity of genera and species of the entire fauna and flora is more important today than ever before, which can also be effectively proven as a fact, and that 5 factors are primarily responsible for the loss of biodiversity. 1. The obstructive and completely irresponsible use of land, as a result of massive overpopulation, not stopping at destroying untouched habitats of nature as a result, such as forests, floodplains, meadows, grasslands and fallow land, as well as moors, swamps, and other wetlands that are drained and built up with houses and other buildings, or converted into pasture or arable land for agriculture. Added to this criminal activity is the exploitation of all possible genera and species of the entire known fauna and flora, including all life forms of all genera and species of the oceans, which has become rampant as a result of overfishing and predation of other marine life, and also many flora, decimating them to near extinction. But there is also the horrendous and all-destroying environmental pollution, whereby plastics and synthetics of all kinds not only pollute the landscapes, waters and seas far and wide, but are also inhaled by human beings and wildlife, and swallowed by those in the sea and land waters, making them sick and suffering, while many die miserably. And it will be that the coming invasion of exotic, foreign genera and species of fauna and flora will put a stop to those firecrackers who idiotically condemn everything about neophytes as invasive, thereby threatening the whole of nature, and thus also biodiversity. Climate change is also having an increasingly disastrous effect, changing and damaging the habitats of animals and plants. And when everything is considered, it all goes way back in time, namely to the beginning, when industrialization and the mania to create overpopulation began. This shows how human beings began to harass creation, namely nature and its entire existence on planet Earth. The megalomaniac Earth humans considered it good to subjugate creation nature, to exploit it and the planet, and also to consume its resources without restraint. The human beings with a sense of reason argue in favor of protecting and preserving nature and biodiversity, and this has probably been incorporated into laws and jurisprudence, economics and politics, technology and science. But lowly intelligent and simple-minded and autocratic rulers have made a mockery of this and continue to do so idiotically. So far, there is no prospect of an improvement, because today it is all about lowly intelligent rulers exercising might, collecting outrageously horrendous salaries, and being able to argue in an arrogantly confused manner, without reason or understanding. This is in contrast to the righteous on their side of government, whom they neither allow to speak nor accept, so they have to remain silent, and are only tolerated. They, the powerful, think how clever they are, because they may have a degree, but have absolutely no life experience. But in their delusion, they believe that they are the greatest and most knowledgeable as well as rulers and experts. But in truth they are just poor wretches, who are also completely irresponsible, and have their crazy confused ideas about sham social and technical infrastructures etc., whereby their lack of intelligence is not able to grasp concepts and realities about the ecological dimensions, but simply completely ignore them in a lowly intelligent and simple-minded way. The fact that such idiotic, lowly intelligent and simple-minded persons who indulge in power, who are in favor of such things and irresponsibly promote them by all means, can exercise their power and stupidity in governments and authorities is unfortunately commonplace nowadays. Because more and more depravity and an absolute and blatant indifference to irresponsibility is emerging, which is spreading faster and faster. This is happening equally in the cities, where the city councilors and their lackeys, as well as in the municipalities, where the local councilors and their fellow supporters are wielding their scepters, and possibly with the help of the police and even the military, if they are mobilized and then get involved. They are shouted down, pushed down, and mendaciously labeled as right-wing extremists by the majority of the powerful rulers, who suppress all those minorities in the governments and parties who do or want to do the correct thing to bring about peace among the peoples, and to do everything right for the planet, nature in its fauna and flora. The unrighteous rulers, however, are allowed to govern and rule over the peoples, and now abuse artificial intelligence, which will bring disaster to Earth humans in the future anyway, even if it is currently still being hailed and praised. What evil will come in this respect in the future is effectively something that the consciously thinking human being cannot imagine despite understanding and reason. However, as far as the crimes of the majority of the autocratic rulers are concerned, it is precisely that part that idiotically disregards the planet, nature, and its fauna and flora and, just as idiotically, wants to further increase the overpopulation, and demands an increased birth rate, and irresponsibly postulates a complete overflow of humanity without thinking, therefore builds morbidly lowly intelligent and simple-minded motorways, sports fields, and apartment blocks, and lets industry drive up much further, and promotes everything that leads to complete destruction and annihilation. The life of the planet, nature, fauna and flora, is completely disregarded and desecrated, destroyed, and rendered completely unviable. The diversity of species, which is vital for the survival of all life, also for human beings, is already dangerously destroyed and annihilated, and in some cases completely wiped out. So much effort and labor cannot make up for it. But the truth is that reduced nature is already threatening our food supply, as well as the future of humanity and everything that is necessary for it, which includes medicine in particular. Species protection has largely disappeared from the headlines. Yet the situation of nature is dramatic, and if we do not intervene and act sensibly and rationally against it, it will not stabilize on its own, or the slow death will become faster and faster. The protection of species effectively needs more and more vehement protection from human beings, and not only in Switzerland, as there are obviously crazy failures in the government and in the authorities, who have no idea what any life needs for its existence. In Switzerland, species protection is being made a pig of by the government in Bern in particular, because it is obviously more important to them to shoot wolves and beavers than to do something to the contrary, for example by educating people so that far fewer offspring are made, and thus, counteract overpopulation. The fact that Switzerland is increasingly overflowing by taking in too many refugees is also of no concern to the government in Bern and those responsible for the authorities in the country, nor do the false humanists of both sexes, who do not realize that in the home countries of the refugees, many of whom die while fleeing, all kinds of things have to be done to ensure that they can make a living there. But as far as the ongoing destruction of biodiversity is concerned, species conservation is also in an extremely precarious and critical state throughout Europe and across the earth. The majority of humanity is obviously not aware of the miserable state of nature, fauna and flora, especially not that huge proportion that lives in cities and only gets to know about nature and fauna and flora from hearsay, films and television. The destruction and devastation caused by wars alone, as well as the senseless littering and disposal of rubbish in the wild and in bodies of water, in the oceans, such as plastic and other things, such as plastics and toxins of all kinds, destroy nature and destroy its fauna and flora. The statistics in this regard are atrocious, especially because no effective laws, rules and regulations exist and are observed, but on the other hand, such false laws, rules and regulations etc. drawn up by states or the authorities by incomprehensible and riveting alleged experts and connoisseurs of nature and fauna and flora, penalize those human beings who do the correct thing for nature, fauna, and flora. False environmental laws, etc., thus add up to the destruction of nature, fauna and flora, the loss of animals, creatures and other wild life forms as well as plants of all genera and species, just as water pollution and horrendous air pollution have also increased in a tremendous and enormous way. Instead of spending vast amounts of money on idiotic buildings, roads, blocks of houses, etc., and on completely wrong laws, regulations, rules, etc., it would be absolutely correct to spend the immense amounts of money on biodiversity and its real protection. Overall, the calculation shows that 65% of Europe's rivers and lakes are already in an extremely desolate and critical state. For Europe alone, the Pleiadians calculate a deterioration of all species and genera of fauna and flora to 65%, also including primeval forests. They calculate up to 70% for the most important ecosystems, meaning that they are already assessed as unfavorable and even inadequate, as I learned from Quetzal. Given all the government spending plans for the future, which include the protection of all nature and fauna and flora, that is to say also the protection of natural landscapes, floodplains, meadows, fields, moors, waters and marshes, etc., as well as the promotion of a greening agriculture, which has become monotonous and bland, should go hand in hand with a further improvement in nature conservation. For a long time now, losses have been seen everywhere as a result of human intervention in nature and continue to be caused by ignorance and lack of knowledge. In the forestry sector, it is unfortunate, uneducated, ill-educated, and autocratic foresters and forest owners, while, on the other hand, well-educated and righteous foresters and forest owners have been complaining for many years about heavy browsing in their forests, because the trees are being damaged by game browsing. This is caused by deer, with trees such as silver fir, rowan, and rowan ash, various oaks and sycamore, maple, but also deciduous trees such as ash, yew, and hornbeam, being particularly susceptible to browsing in winter, while spruce trees are less affected. This happens particularly when there is a lack of other food, which means that these trees are more likely to be browsed. However, all these trees, except the silver fir, are no longer planted in such large numbers as they used to be, when there were still large and even huge forests of oak trees, but these were ludicrously clear-cut to make railway sleepers from the trunks, which served as a railway track substructure. As a result, through the fault of human beings, the oak forest disappeared, and conifers began to be cultivated, giving rise to forests of silver fir and Norway spruce throughout Europe. Today, it is claimed that a large number of hunters do not keep the deer population under control out of greed, because they crave large antlers, and thus allow the deer population to grow too much, instead of reducing it by shooting them. This is necessary, because, on the one hand, the overpopulation of humanity needs its habitat. But this is an outrageous lie and misrepresentation of the facts. The truth is that human beings, through their horrendous mass of overpopulation, have engaged in and continue to engage in machinations of land theft, whereby the habitat of all wildlife has been stolen away more and more, which continues to happen as a result of the madness of the insane, irrational, and criminal further increase in overpopulation. What has happened so far in this wise has largely destroyed or decimated and changed a great deal in nature and unscrupulously taken it away from all wild animal life, as a result of which it is now so restricted and increasingly dependent on browsing trees for its necessary and vital food, through the fault of human beings. On the other hand, it should also be noted that human beings are undeniably to blame for the fact that deer in particular are getting out of hand, because they, human beings, have decimated their natural enemies, such as bears, lynxes, and foxes, and have almost or completely wiped out wolves. The very last and real Swiss bear was cowardly and completely unscrupulously shot by two chamois hunters in Misaks in 1898, and the two cowardly marksmen were celebrated as heroes. Similarly, two hunters in Graubünden cowardly shot a bear that had immigrated from Italy in 1904, and were also celebrated as heroes. And if I remember correctly, it was in 2005 that another bear immigrated to Switzerland from Italy, which I was able to touch invisibly and imperceptibly when I was taken there on a beamship. And I would like to say from my own experience that bears do not regard human beings as potential prey, but rather fear them, avoid them, and keep their distance, only attacking when provoked or frightened. Provocation can easily occur if the bear's habitat is cut off due to human guilt and unreasonableness, and they, therefore, enter human habitation areas, like other wild animals, and feel threatened and provoked by human beings. This is particularly the case when female bears have cubs with them, and feel particularly provoked by their protective instincts when human beings come near them. Deer hide in the woods and are nocturnal, with many farmers believing that their crops will be damaged because the deer eat the rising grain seed. Farmers therefore also scare the deer away. But the fact is that eaten cereal seed, as with various other plants, grows back and becomes stronger and even emerges more vigorously. This can also be seen everywhere in the flora, and proves that nature works a lot differently than is assumed and claimed by the so-called experts, which means that what I learned from SFAAT corresponds to the correctness and truth. For example, I learned that various plants that have disappeared due to the fault of human beings, but have not really been wiped out, can be recovered, which can be done if human beings really make an effort to correct the error that is responsible for the disappearance, which was committed and led to the stunted growth and disappearance. This was and is not only the case for flora, but also for fauna. One of the reasons why these genera and species decline, disappear, or even become extinct is, for example, because their living creatures have been poisoned or killed, and their populations have been criminally minimized, or, as I said, even wiped out and are still being harassed in some way. In this way, plants of various species and kinds, as well as creatures, animals and other forms of wildlife, also in water, and in the oceans, which has catastrophic effects on the genera and species of fauna and flora, as well as on the forests, waters, meadows and air, floodplains and meadows, moors, swamps, fallow land, mountains, seas, and primeval forests, or rainforests, as well as on the rainforests, and even deserts. For example, the decimation of genera and species of fauna and flora results in other genera and species reproducing in such explosive masses that they in turn destroy other genera and species, even wipe them out, or destroy their shelters, so that they are no longer able to protect themselves from predators. Many marine organisms in particular need specially protected places and sites for the growth of offspring. But if these places are lacking, the corresponding marine organisms can become extinct. This is particularly precarious when it comes to the loss of protected places that provide food for fish, which in turn are important for fishing. The human being's diet is dependent on this, which proves that the ecological balance is not only a great necessity on land, in forests and mountains, etc., but also in waterways and oceans. However, this is already so damaged as a result of mass overpopulation and the criminal activities that are destroying nature to such an extent that what can still be saved must be restored as quickly as possible. However, this does not change the fundamentally precarious and dire situation, because the entire global biodiversity has already been damaged or even destroyed or wiped out to such an extent that millions of billions of genera and species have been wiped out by criminal machinations, and millions more are threatened with extinction. Although these figures are based on rather inaccurate estimates, they are nevertheless based on truth, which cannot be disputed. The truth is also that we Earthlings do not even know how many genera and species there are in the terrestrial fauna and flora, because humanity has never been able to count them, and new genera and species are constantly being discovered. If climate change is now being considered in the coming wise of climate-resilient reorganization of nature as a whole, namely in such a way that various neophytes, that is to say, alien plants, are to be considered and planted with regard to flora, then this is to be adapted to the urgency. However, this must be done in opposition to those lowly intelligent fanatics who have been illegally labeling and condemning more and more neophytes as invasive, and thus as proliferating, for centuries, and also constantly today, although these neophyte flora and flora species are by no means such. In fact, there are only very few exceptions, such as the rampant balsam. And as I have seen the future together with SFIF, it is absolutely inevitable that neophytes will gain a foothold in Europe, not only by being introduced and planted more and more, but also by migrating and spreading naturally. In the future, Europe will have a heat-resistant mixed flora, as SFA had called it when we saw them together in the future, and he explained that Earth humans, who are overflowing in numbers, will bring this on themselves by destroying nature, the climate and the atmosphere, that as a result of self-inflicted climate change by Earthlings, they now have to do what they can to reshape nature, because it is not as simple as the know-it-alls and experts imagine the future consequences for nature as a result of climate change. There will be changes that are neither considered nor foreseen, as FSAF and I have seen in the future. This alone means that in the future, seen only once in Europe, traditional plantations and new plantations of all genera and species will have to be protected with fences against wildlife predation and destruction, because many wildlife forms had been restricted as a result of predation, and the destruction of their habitats by human beings and the very precarious shortage of food opportunities for them will lead to major problems. This will occur far and wide, not only in crop fields and vegetable plots, but also in private gardens, as various forms of wildlife will increasingly lose their fear of human beings and invade their living areas. This will bring with it various dangers, such as diseases and also attacks by wild animals on human beings, especially by foxes and wolves, but large birds of prey and other birds will also be among them. It will absolutely also be necessary to replant forests, which will also have to be protected from game predation by fences, even if human beings release more predators back into the wild. The return of predators is important because it will also prevent diseases and rampantly spreading diseases, as they mainly prey on old, sick, and weakened animals and creatures, as well as birds and aquatic life. This means that, in addition to carrion, they also eliminate sick creatures, which will prevent the spread of diseases among wildlife, which can spread on all land, in the mountains, and in waterways and seas. For this reason alone, a very useful breeding and reintroduction of wild animals would be necessary, as well as a long overdue and really effective and absolutely correct species protection measure through the complete reintroduction of a necessary predator population of bears, foxes, lynxes, and wolves, but also the protection and possible breeding of the many birds of prey I know of, such as the eagle and griffon vulture, short-toed eagle and red kite, owls, bearded vulture, goshawk, and golden eagle, little owl, salkin, pygmy owl, buzzard, osprey, boreal owl, sparrowhawk, tree marsh harrier, and also the kestrel, and black kite, as well as the long-eared owl, tawny owl, and honeyscopes owl, peregrine eagle, owl, short-eared owl, and barn owl. The idiocy of mowing many meadows 5 times a year in Switzerland is causing many rare meadow flowers to disappear completely, as well as skylarks and other wildlife. In addition, we have such clever and smart people in the Federal Council and Parliament, who are actually so lowly, intelligent, and simple-minded, that they prefer to build motorways and other nonsense, instead of safeguarding biodiversity, and thus the diversity of life. Biodiversity is being made a complete mess of by these horn dogs of government, and they are also irresponsibly jeopardizing the health and lives of the Swiss population as a result of their blatant, abysmal ignorance and incompetence. How equally lowly intelligent and simple-minded those must be who elect such incompetent and uneducated elements, who are completely ignorant of all the important necessities of life, into government. And these irresponsible people in government still allow meadows to be criminally mown 5 times a year in agriculture, even though many wild creatures are losing their habitat as a result, and are slowly but surely being wiped out. But that is not all, because these damned rulers, with the righteous being completely excluded, of course, still allow farmers to spread these and those toxins in their fields, meadows and fields, etc., which poison and pollute the food grown, the environment, and the atmosphere, and contaminate everything and anything. The fact that many human beings absorb these toxins and become ill and die as a result is of no concern to these irresponsible people, because the main thing for them is that they can make a lot of money. The irresponsible farmers, who completely disregard biodiversity and wildlife, mow the meadows 5 times a year because they are greedy for money and also produce silage or silage fodder with the mowed grass. As a result, not only do they ensure that many creatures that depend on the meadows and the meadow ground no longer find any food because the grass can no longer grow correctly and becomes increasingly sparse, but growth is consequently stimulated again with chemical toxic fertilizers. The truth is, however, that the grass can no longer recover and can also no longer produce seeds or grow. As a result, the food source or food for numerous insects also disappears, as does the possibility of the necessary space for their breeding. This is because the insects, which are also vital for human beings, can no longer lay their eggs on the blades of grass, etc. As a result, there is a dramatic decline in the diversity of all insects that depend on grass or meadows. This also means that the food for birds or certain bats becomes passé, while other creatures in the wild also disappear, such as mice and hamsters, as well as salamanders, snails, slowworms, etc., which in turn are important as food for foxes, badgers, hedgehogs, and birds of prey. As the grass disappears, the meadow flowers are also dying out, and so are the insects, many of which are also pollinators, and as many human beings do not realize, and I should therefore mention, certain bats are also good pollinators. As a result, bushes and trees close to the fields are no longer pollinated, and songbirds also suffer because they can no longer find food, which for birds consists mainly of seeds, all kinds of nuts, fruit and fruit pips, etc. Meadows that are irresponsibly mown 5 times a year are death grounds for meadow insects, and it is precisely these missing insects that are also very important as pollinators for many types of fruit and vegetables, with SFAA teaching me that a good 67% of all plants, from the smallest to the largest, that need to be fertilized or pollinated are dependent on insects for their pollination. This is despite the fact that honeybees make a further but small contribution, while wild bees do much more in this respect, and the wind, beetles, birds, and other creatures also provide the necessary pollination. If we now take a closer look and analyze everything, it is frightening to realize that in industrialized agriculture, the insane application of chemical fertilizers and poisons, as well as the spraying of pesticides, is still as commonplace as it is in fruit tree plantations, nurseries, and private gardens. Since the early beginnings of these crimes against nature, this has led to the great extinction of insects of all genera and species in many places. And although this is known today, this criminal behavior and actions continue indifferently. Many landowners, farmers, nurseries, and private gardeners continue in the old style. And if this continues, with the addition of artificial intelligence, which is now getting involved in order to promote everything chemically, then everything will quickly go downhill and bring about the total end, faster than any earthling can imagine. The whole thing which is being pursued out of sheer greed for money, also has serious consequences for the health of human beings, namely that in the future, chemical fertilizers would be used to grow plants for medicines, which would then be contaminated by the chemicals and processed into medicines. According to Svath, the active plant substances would then remain beneficial to health in the future, as is also the case with medicinal plants, but as he explained, they would only be contaminated with small amounts of toxic substances in the future as a result of the chemical fertilizers that promote growth. This will hardly be detectable, but the small amount of poison is poison, which even in the smallest quantity has a detrimental effect on the body and the whole organism, but this is deliberately concealed or not even recognized. The fact is, however, that even the smallest amount of toxic substance, regardless of the type, is harmful to every life form in some wise, and therefore also to human beings. And if you examine the composition of all medicines, there are a great many of them that contain active plant substances, which have also been cultivated using artificial chemical fertilizers, and which are also impregnated with chemical substances that serve as the necessary basis for the medicine, that is to say, as a building block, so to speak. The same is also true of medicines that contain healing microorganisms, as well as others whose healing active ingredients are of animal origin or from fungi or pure bacteria. If everything is analyzed carefully, it turns out that many really good antibiotics and medicines contain natural active ingredients. But caution is always advised because too much of a natural active ingredient can also have dangerous health and even fatal consequences. The human being makes use of nature and its plants and all sorts of other things that nature itself has developed in the course of its existence as a defense to render bacteria, pests and even viruses harmless, for which the human being should actually be grateful, but he should always exercise caution to ensure that he does not use anything detrimental and does not suffer any harm. Someone recently wrote, as I read, "For many people, nature has its own enforceable right, as a number of states have already included it in their legislation. These call for a socio-ecological transformation of property, which means, among other things, that owners of forests, for example, may only use them sustainably. There are familiar demands, such as a change in diet, away from meat and towards plants. In addition, indigenous peoples, who have a completely different understanding of nature than capitalist societies, should be recognized as having the right to preserve their natural environment. Well, there are good and valuable proposals for better ecological transformations coming from some quarters that seem utopian to so-called democratic societies, because the proposals demand sacrifice and changes in behavior. Much of the climate protection already encounters inexplicable massive resistance, probably because it would mean giving up our own excesses of comfort and luxury. However, the most urgent time has now come, as it is absolutely necessary to finally engage in the most thorough political, technical, and also ethical debate with a human society that is hostile to nature, and to confront it in order to convince it that, in addition to flora, the diversity of fauna is now also a top priority, as this has also fallen alarmingly behind, because human beings have largely destroyed their habitat through the absolutely wrong machinations of overpopulation and wars. This is despite the fact that humanity is massively harming itself in the process. Unfortunately, there is a widespread lack of effective common sense and reason in the human population all over the earth, and thus, of course, a lack of the emotional dimension. He lacks comprehensible examples of what the loss of biodiversity of fauna and flora actually means in concrete terms. Some human beings come up with very theoretical, also coolly scientific discussions and advice, etc., regarding the existence of humanity, nature and its fauna and flora, as do those who organize the climate conference. But they all come across as if the various topics were of no personal concern to the grandiloquent authors. This is despite the fact that they lament the loss and destruction of nature, as well as the extinction of various species of flora and fauna, which is clearly progressing inexorably, because the majority of humanity is completely indifferent and has become absolutely irresponsible and dissolute. The representatives of the climate conference are just flushing away horrendous amounts of money and having a good time, paying for an expensive trip and stay, etc. at the taxpayers' expense, but without considering and doing the sensible thing for climate protection, namely deciding on a birth regulation. This would take the form of a regulated stop to births in order to reduce the Earth human population and put an end to the further destruction of the climate, nature, and the extinction of flora and fauna, as well as the further poisoning of the atmosphere. But all the powerful and big-snouted people in government, who do not understand anything about creation and nature, let alone its fauna and flora, only receive horrendous rewards, and are so lowly intelligent and simple-minded that they do not even realize where the dog in the manger lies, namely an overpopulation, whose machinations are destroying the climate and nature, which is slowly but surely turning the whole planet Earth into a pig and making it unfit for life. Just as the destruction of nature and the extinction of fauna and flora on the land, in the fields, in the mountains and forests, floodplains, moors and marshes, this is also the case in all waters, as well as in the depths of the oceans, where Earth humans are destroying and polluting, as well as exploiting to the last. This is in addition to the fact that the forests, the land, and the waters and seas are contaminated with all kinds of rubbish, such as plastic and synthetic materials of all kinds, how this happens, and how these substances decompose into the smallest particles, which are inhaled and swallowed by life forms, and fall ill, and ultimately perish miserably, or even die miserably. And when I think about everything I have learned from SFOF, it all adds up, and if I call the oceans that, it is because their life forms are as vital to all life as the biodiversity on land, in the waters, forests, and mountains. In addition, the oceans cover around 75% of planet Earth, and are of absolutely crucial importance for the Earth's ecological balance. So far, they're still slowing down the pace of climate change, but it is inevitable that they will continue to warm up and thus change and warm the climate even more, which will rise by more than 2 degrees in the future. The evaporation of very large quantities of water from the oceans alone, but also from the waters of the planet's land, is increasingly resulting in the formation of enormous water-bearing cloud formations, which cause primeval storms through the winds and bring immense and primeval torrential floods of water masses over the mainland of all countries on Earth, which Earth humans can no longer control, and which bring a great deal of death, ruin, and destruction. For the time being, the seas are already affecting all continents to a lesser extent, but this will take on even worse forms in the future. And what will become even worse is the fact that the waters and seas are becoming more and more acidic, and the atmosphere is also becoming more and more poisoned as a result of the ever-increasing mass of carbon dioxide produced by human beings and deposited in the waters, seas, and atmosphere. However, this in turn has further harmful consequences, as it massively impairs and destroys coral reefs, which are important birthplaces and also safe havens from danger for countless species of fish and various marine animals. However, the increasing acidification of waters and oceans, and carbon dioxide pollution, are also having a negative impact on all life forms on land, in forests, floodplains, meadows, moors, and swamps, as well as on microorganisms and phytoplankton, which is of central importance for ecosystems and the climate. This is because it produces a large proportion of Earth's oxygen through photosynthesis and binds carbon dioxide. Basically, it forms the basis of the marine food chain because it is consumed as food by small organisms and also by large marine organisms. It also serves as a very important indicator of the health and condition of marine ecosystems, because it is sensitive to environmental changes. Phytoplankton is very important for the climate. It is also very important because it also alters growth. For example, when sea temperatures rise, the growth of phytoplankton can be restricted because it increases ocean stratification, and thus hinders the transport of nutrients from the depths. Species shifts also occur, whereby various smaller phytoplankton species can become much more abundant, but larger species become rarer, which are decidedly more important, and these are actually decisive for carbon transport into the deep sea. However, if the seawater becomes warmer, this weakens, but the respiration of organisms increases, which means that more of what is absorbed is released back into the atmosphere, which of course reduces carbon storage. The functions of phytoplankton are important for the climate, as it produces at least half of all oxygen on Earth through photosynthesis. It absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere and converts it into biomass, so its content would be much higher if this phytoplankton process did not take place. However, when the phytoplankton dies, its carbon-rich bodies sink to the seafloor and store the carbon down there. Finally, I have to explain that in certain regions, such as the Southern Ocean, phytoplankton aerosols promote cloud formation, which reduces heat and thus has a certain cooling effect on the climate. Despite the various dives with FSAF to the bottom of the deepest deep in the Mariana Trench, and the diverse marine life and its countless fascinating mountain landscapes, the depth of the oceans remains a great mystery to me. And with that, I have actually said some of what I have learned from SFAF and still remember, which for you is probably
Was very interesting, which is why I also did not interrupt you in your flow of words with questions. I also know from Swath's annals that you were also with him all over the planet, and also in the various primeval forests and deserts, etc., as well as on top of the highest mountain peaks where...
yes. But I do not want to talk about that, because I do not want to take the place of the magmen of this world who believe that they have achieved something G-vault with their first ascents. Many believed, and still believe today, that the climb was necessary to make a name for themselves, to be a celebrity throughout the world, like countless others, such as actors, politicians, and many others. Many have also lost their lives while scrambling up mountains, which could not happen to me with Swath, because he was always very concerned about me. And besides, I did not have to climb a mountain, because we could get to the top of mountains everywhere with his bean ship.
Of course, that was also to be expected. But now, dear friend, it is time for me to return, for my duty calls me. Goodbye.
Sure. Time passes so quickly. Goodbye.
November 3rd, 2025.
Since you are also here today dictating to me what we talked about together, which is actually our last conversation, I think I can give you this to read. The whole thing relates to what relates to this crazy sectarian African American who was plotting against all Fiduans, and therefore also against me, with lies and accusations made out of thin air. He is now also dragging innocent third parties and persons not involved with Figu into his web of lies and accusations. I did not want to mention his name, but now this is happening elsewhere, which I cannot prevent, because this man has gone too far with his lying accusations, and therefore others are fighting back and mentioning his name. So, here you can read what is going on and what I had already oriented Quetzal about. Well, passive members have also written to us about this nonsense from, and I am attaching one of the following letters so that you can see what is going on.
Quetzal has informed us about this, but let us see.
Mail from Michael Horn dated 30.10. 25/1756 HRS.
Dear Billy, dear Bernadette, and dear Michael, please take a look at the following documents. As you will see, Jedi Ram Marine falsely and fraudulently posed as a lawyer and wrote the alleged legal threats himself. I have received the following from the real lawyer, Ms. Erin Klug.
On September 9, 2025 at 12:54 HRS, Aaron Klug wrote,
Dear Mr. Horn, we have received the attached letter and correspondence. Please note that we do not and have never represented Mr. Ramnarine. We have never communicated with Mr. Ramnarine. We have responded to the Michigan State Bar Grievance Commission accordingly. Aaron Klug is being impersonated by an unknown third party. We have reported this matter to the FBI, the Michigan State Bar Association, the Michigan State Bar Grievance Commission, and the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Thank you, Aaron Klug, Patent and Trademark Attorney.
Note, we have the content of the original email from the law firm, but it will not be published because the email is protected by copyright.
I had initiated action by reporting the threats from what I believe to be the actual attorney and the law firm. They were notified and subsequently contacted and received the documents. I agreed not to write publicly about the matter. After reading what you said in court, 919, I wrote to Mrs. Klug to see if there were any further restrictions on her part. Since this harassment has affected me, my family, and others, I reserve the right to provide you, Billy, and the public with corresponding information. But I will wait and see what Mrs. Klug has to say. Solomie, M.H.
On August 10, 2025, 1752 wrote, S.
Solomie Bernadette. I am contacting you because I have been thinking about the troublesome drama regarding slander or accusations. A case has come to light in Austria that also involved insults and hatred, etc. on the net. And this case is still ongoing. In this particular case, it is now the case that all the perpetrators who have made unfair comments about Mr. Born-Mena on social networks have been or are being investigated. I thought it might be an option to consider something like this. Perhaps there is a litigation funder who would look at our case. I do not think it can be that lies and crazy allegations are simply being made on the net against Billy, the FIGU in general, and even against certain individual FIGU members. Link below. So this is really disgusting to me. I understand that Billy does not want to defend himself against this. But if individual FIGU members are being framed as criminal elements, we should not just take it lying down, if there is a way to counter the insanity through the courts. After I went looking for these scribblings, I came across 2 different pages yesterday, one of which has the reference at the bottom, dangersoftbillymeyercultist.com.
Public call to action. If you have been harmed by Billy Meier, MH, FIGU, or any of their affiliates, submit your story anonymously. We are gathering an international class action legal bundle and have already won several early battles. You will be protected.
Greetings, S.
Reply to S. From 12.10. 25.
Salome S. Excuse me for only replying to you now. We have had a problem with our mail server since Thursday morning, which could only be resolved yesterday evening. But now everything is working fine again. We know who is behind this website, and the matter is in good hands. We ourselves do not want to and cannot get involved in a legal dispute with the owner of the website because we have to assume that, for various obvious reasons, our rights would be disregarded and, in the worst case, the owner would be supported. By not reacting, we are giving the person the lie anyway, and we also do not assume that they have already been able to recruit persons for a class action. It is certainly nothing but hot air and not worth mentioning. Of course, such actions are repugnant, but in our experience the least damage is done if we simply keep quiet, because then the matter simply dissolves due to a lack of response from our side. Apart from that, we have not the slightest reason to take the unfounded accusations and allegations personally, because we have done nothing wrong. Kind regards, also from Billy and Salome Bernadette.
All this just leaves me astonished, and I do not want to take a position on the whole thing, because trying to understand such a tiresome thing intellectually is like paying attention to it, which it is not worthy of.
I think so too, which is why nothing will also be done from our side, because it would only be carrying water into the Rhine, as we say for doing useless things. Unfortunately, this is apparently really sick in the head, as a result of hatred, and therefore also no longer sane. Besides, this is apparently not taken lightly in America, as Aaron Klug's letter indicates.
That is indeed to be assumed from the letter.
There is. But it is his own fault. What he gets himself into with his hatred and his lies, that is what he has to pay for, as it is. The human being has to answer for his own actions, whether they are positive or negative. But something else, the letter here, which Quetzal photographed and said that he would pass the whole thing on to Ta, I want to ask again, whether an answer is to be expected, and whether Ptah has responded to it at all, or whether the whole thing has been forgotten.
Question to Billy Edward Albert Meier. Billy Edward Albert Meier, referring to the 916th contact of Saturday, the 23rd of August 2025, 6.47h, as well as to earlier statements in the contact reports.
Dear Billy, from your published contact reports, especially the conversation with Quetzal, it is clear that his grandfather was commissioned by a Plejaren committee to accompany you since your birth, to teach you, and to give you insights into the past, the future, and reality. From what I could gather from your statements, Quetzal's grandfather apparently also made written records in his mother tongue, the Sherrod language, using the Plejaren alphabet. In this context, I have the following question. If the Plejaren alphabet could be officially integrated into the international Unicode system, and thus made digitally representable worldwide, would it, in your view, be conceivable or even permitted to transcribe certain original texts or excerpts from Quetzal's grandfather's records in this authentic written form, or to represent them for certain study or preservation purposes, provided that it is done in compliance with the given confidentiality obligations? Could this possibly be a contribution to preserving some of the original wisdom and language in its unadulterated form, without any loss of meaning, through earthly translation or interpretation? Or will such a purely formal presentation, without deciphering the content, also already be a violation of the confidentiality imposed on you? With heartfelt thanks to you for your time and your decades of work in the service of truth and the development of consciousness, best regards, Blaram.
We cannot speak of forgetting, but of the fact that it was discussed in detail by the committee, because Tao decided that Blaram's request should be considered, and he therefore brought the matter to the committee and had it discussed. However, it was rejected after lengthy and detailed deliberation, with various reasons being given that were considered plausible.
Nothing can be done about that, I thought. In general, you do not get involved in anything. But I would like to show you this, which Akim emailed to me.
Round work. What Billy and the Fee Gu are doing in the modern era of the 21st century is like the foundation of a house on which humanity, after a long standstill of its evolution in the fourth millennium, finally, the house of knowledge, wisdom, and love, to live in it in unity, harmony, and joy. In the awareness of unity with creation and its high task will learn, understand itself, and joyfully evolve. Achimwolf, Freunderwahrheit, dated November 1st, 2025.
One with everything, in the perfect harmony of free, unspoiled nature. The human being is in himself another being with open and unbound senses and joyful, happy thoughts and feelings when he thinks awareness, that he thinks, feels, and senses, that he is one with everything, with everything in the nature of creation, inseparably connected. Archenwolf, find a Wahrheit at the November 1st, 2025.
All encompassing self responsibility. The human being on earth can only himself out of the darkness of ignorance and his self-induced tyranny and self-imposed tyranny in self-importance. Even if he believes that a God guides and determines his destiny, it is always his own might of consciousness and the life energy of creation through which he can control everything without exception by virtue of natural causality itself and responsibly. Achimwolf, Freunderwahrheit, dated November 1st, 2025.